This is the Wrap on Aging, and I'm Rob Enns, your host with the Utah Commission on Aging. The Wrap on Aging informs and empowers Utah's older adults through research, education, public policy, and connects you to vital services. Today's program is a three-part series on grief and loss. Our guest host is Caroline Glissmeyer, speaking with Dr. Kathy Supiano.
Hi, everyone. I am Caroline Glissmeyer, and there's a quote by Margaret J. Wheatley that is a quote that I just love. There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And as we finish our podcast on grief with our third segment of the podcast, we are going to learn more about the concept of grief literacy, its importance, and why this is something that our communities need to care about. As grieving is a universal experience, this conversation is vital to knowing how communities can best interact with and help grievers and become more grief literate. Back to discuss this important concept with us is Dr. Kathy Supiano, who is the Director of Caring Connections, a Hope and Comfort in Grief program. Caring Connections is the nonprofit grief support program located in the University of Utah College of Nursing. Welcome back, Dr. Supiano. We're grateful that you're joining us once again.
Thank you, Caroline.
And we're excited, or I'm excited, to talk to you today about how we can develop a compassionate community to support the grievers within each of our communities, wherever we may live. So I would love to discuss with you some of your thoughts relating to the beliefs that our communities have about grief. And if we could start out by talking about what do you think are some harmful beliefs that communities in general have that can be problematic for their community?
Yeah. Well, thanks. And so I guess we could start with that as the problems. And I think what we see in our community, and I'm not surprising anyone when I talk about how divisive society is and how fragmented we are. But the reality is all of the communities we're in, whether it's our work, our community, our neighborhood, our professional communities, what happens is within those communities at any given time, people are suffering. And we've talked about grief a lot, but people can suffer in a lot of different ways. And so one of the things that actually divides us is when we see people who are suffering, we have two choices in our response. We can respond with compassion, empathy, and understanding. And I would say compassion is different from empathy in that compassion also brings a desire to help, a desire to bring change. Or we can respond with indifference or actually even judgment. A lot of times when there's a suffering in a community, let's just think a shooting or, a mass casualty, we tend to, as human beings, this is unfortunately kind of automatic, we tend to blame the victim. Oh, what were they doing? Why were they out so late? Did they get into this situation? Why didn't they plan ahead? And we don't want that. Instead, we want to respond with compassion. But again, just like we talked about with grief in general, people can be clumsy about how they do that. And so the idea of compassionate communities for grief or for all forms of human suffering is that there are kind of three essentials. And this is from some of the writings of Thomas Friedman, where he says there are three things that are essential in a community where people are compassionate. And one is that they connect with each other relationally, like I am part of your community, even though my child wasn't in that school's in my state or in my neighborhood. So I care about you. I'm connected to you. And connection brings obligation, right? So connect. And the next thing is respect. Your situation is different than mine. I'm not telling you what to do. I respect where you are in your suffering, and I will bring to your suffering, to the extent I can, the help that you want. Not the help I just happen to be willing to give you, but the help that you tell me is helpful. And then the last thing is protect. And so particularly in communities that have danger inherent in them, a community protects its people. And who do we protect? We protect those who are the most vulnerable, children, of course, older adults, of course, that's what we're talking about, but also people who are marginalized or under-resourced or disrespected. And when they suffer, we say, we recognize that your needs may be greater, and therefore we will bring more support to you. So I think that's kind of key in a compassionate community. Are people connected? Are they respected? And are they protected? So in the context of suffering, what that means is I connect to your suffering because I'm a human being. I've either suffered or I'm going to. That's just what it means. I respect your situation as unique, but I am willing to augment, give you my time or my resources, and then protect. I see you suffering. I don't want you to endure greater harm. What can I do to lift you up and protect you?
Mm. Those are really good specific examples. I'm glad that you specified that. And I think that those ideas of connecting, respecting, and protecting are sometimes things that we overlook with older adults, right? Connecting is something that is so
Yeah.
important for them that they often don't get enough of. And then also respecting older adults is something that we also as community can sometimes have a problem with because of ageism, really.
Exactly. Yes. And thanks for nailing ageism. But, the connection, we talked about diminishing number of relationships over the life course and how important it is to augment those. We know what a problem loneliness is nationwide with older adults. And respecting, honoring our elders, something that we as Americans have lost as a core value, even though many other persons from other countries bring that value to the United States. Collectively, I do think we do not value older adults and respect them enough. And then protecting, again, many people who live to very late life will be functional. Other people will be vulnerable. And if we value all life, then we extend protection to people who may not be able to, for whatever reason, any form of infirmity or economic catastrophe. We need to bring some protection to them and not kick them to the curb.
Yeah, that is definitely something that we all need to be conscious of, things that we need to, try to make a more common part of the communities that we belong to. And that's something that every single person can do, right? On the individual
Yeah,
basis.
but
Individuals make up communities.
exactly. But the collective matters. And so this compassionate communities movement, this actually started in Canada and is now, and actually became written into law about how we are to care for each other. And then, that we see this movement happening in Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, other countries across the globe are recognizing, and this I think is pandemic wisdom, that so much has divided us, yet we have common values, and our values are we take care of each other. And I think that's just something we need to get back to. It's kind of the golden rule, very simple, but just getting back to this idea of recognizing suffering and maybe not trying to solve it necessarily, but being willing to recognize it, support it, and keep people from further harm.
Yes, recognizing and supporting, I think, is something we have talked about a lot in each of these different podcast episodes. And so that's definitely key as well. So, and I know I've heard you talk about the idea of grief literacy, and this is kind of a concept that's really important for communities to understand, right? Because grief literacy helps people understand specifically how to help those in their community who are grieving. So, can you talk a little bit more about grief literacy and why that's so important?
Yeah, it's kind of a awkward term, isn't it? Grief literacy, but being literate in what grief is all about, being knowledgeable and understanding of the dynamics of grief is something we're all capable of. And so when we talked about grief in these podcasts, we talked about prolonged grief, right? And for people with serious disabling grief, they need a professional to help them navigate that. For other people, they need a support group of grievers. And, our groups are led by clinicians, but they're peer support groups as well, where you're gathering with a group of people who understand this loss because they've had that kind of loss. Those are really important. And those are sort of public health, mental health initiatives. But what we're talking about with grief literacy is creating a society where every person has enough understanding about grief that they are treating people who are grieving or suffering with the same respect and understanding that they would want. So they're not cruel. They're not saying, oh, snap out of it. It's been 2 weeks since your child died. You should be over it. People say things like that,
Oh
Carol.
my goodness,
Believe me.
that is just heartbreaking to hear, honestly.
Yeah, so no, those are the cruel people, but most people aren't cruel. Like we said, most people are actually kind of awkward. And so giving people the sense that they don't have to solve the problem, they can listen, they can say, well, of course, you think about it, it makes perfect sense if this person is crying because their son died just a couple weeks ago. So I'm not going to avoid them. I'm not going to scold them. I'm not going to tell them they should be grateful. I'm going to come up and very gently say, it's all right. You're not upsetting me by crying. It makes perfect sense to me that you're crying. I just want you to know I'm available. Okay. Most of the time that person's going to turn and not need you, but they might. Some of the most therapeutic conversations I've ever had have been on public transportation where I sat down next to a person and they just so needed to tell a story that they told a story. I never told them I was a therapist. I just let them talk, right?
Yeah.
They got a free hour. What can I say?
I know, my goodness,
But-
little did they know.
But no, but what I'm saying is it doesn't take my PhD. It doesn't take my clinical expertise to sit in what I call the room of suffering and just say, I'm here. I don't have answers. You don't want answers, which is good because I don't have answers for you. But I can sit here and try to understand. And so when you say my son just died 2 weeks ago, and I can say to you, oh, tell me about your son. And that person can say, my son is a 50-year-old man and he raised a family and so forth, or my son is a 10-year-old boy and he was crossing the street and this tragedy happened. And just giving people that space. And, that's sort of a pop expression, give people space, but that's how we in mental health have been talking for decades. Give people that container, be that container just to let people have their pain without trying to solve it. When people are absolutely stuck, they need someone like me. But most of the time, Caroline, they need someone like you. Just someone who's courteous and compassionate and kind without your own agenda to make people feel better so that you feel better.
Oh yeah, which is something we all do, I think, as a knee-jerk reaction sometimes, just trying to fix the problem, which again we've talked about a lot, and I think
usually that's to make us feel better. Oh, don't cry because I don't like tears.
Yeah, don't cry. Let me tell you this thing that's kind of a silver lining, and that's something that Brene Brown talks about when she talks about empathy, right? Is not trying to silver line people's problems because that's not helping them.
Or like we said before, tell people they should be grateful. Right. You should be grateful.
Yeah, that's an example of doing that silver lining.
Mm-hmm.
So, and just being present, I think. And so what do you think, are there any more specific ways that you think that the people listening to this podcast or people like me can do things that they can do to help with grief literacy in their communities?
Yeah.
And that connection?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing is just an invitation. Think about all the different communities you're in. I mean, all of us are in multiple communities, right? You're in a school community. I'm in a university community. I have classrooms of people. I have groups of colleagues. I have friends all over the country. I have a neighborhood. And so, when we're aware of challenges in people in our various communities, be ready to respond, but ready to respond without necessarily answers or prescriptions or solutions. But that said, I do think there needs to be actually a lot of education in the community. We're doing a lot of this work in schools with teachers who, they're dealing with serious deaths, death of a student by suicide, but also the losses and the bumps and the bruises that kids just have in life. Or a child comes to school and the parent died over the weekend, or the grandparent died, or the dog died. And so that we give people the skills to understand, number one, and then the skill to be comfortable with our approach, not pressuring, but not avoiding that sweet spot, and just saying, I'm available. I can't possibly understand what you're going through right now, but I am willing to listen. I'm willing to care, and so forth. So I was caring for a family with this young boy, and his brother died by suicide. He was a school-age boy, and the parents told this wonderful story about the teacher in that classroom. And the teacher made the boy stay after school, said, you have to come after class and talk with me. And this is a boy whose brother had just taken his life and was a child in the very same high school. Both boys were in the same high school. And the boy was, like, oh, what, was I crying? Was I inappropriate or something? This kid said. And the teacher sat down with him and he said, I just want you to know, when I was young, when I was your age, my father took his life. And that's not the same as losing a brother. But I just want you to know, any day after school, you just want to come in and talk, or you just want to come in and sit, you can just come in. And the dad and the mom who I saw with this young man said, we lost our son. I mean, we just don't feel like we could even, we were so frantic ourselves. We couldn't. And he said that the dad said, that teacher, I think, saved our son's life because, and I'm a good dad, but at that moment, I was taking care of my wife. I'm taking care of myself. And he said, I needed more than just what we could do in our family. So I don't even know if the boy went and visited the teacher after school, but he knew he could. And so, yes, he had probably a wonderful counselor in the school and a school social worker, but he also had one human being who got it. And just without saying, you can come and talk with me and I know what to tell you. He didn't say that at all. He just said, you can come. You can just come. So each of us can use our own suffering, not to say, this worked for me, therefore you should, not to use it that way, but to say, oh man, I remember what it's like to hurt. And I don't have the answers for your hurt, but I can show up and be with you. Now, if you multiplied that by 10, if you multiplied that by 100 or 1,000, and if we could just make people knowledgeable, comfortable, and to be able to go in without the desire to fix it, that, Caroline, is how you grow a compassionate community. So this needs to be done in churches. This needs to be done in schools. We definitely want to respond when a community suffers a loss, like a shooting or a fire or something like that. We do want a community to rally, okay? But we don't want them to do it in a way that's not helpful. We want them to do it in a way that's helpful. We want them to feel comfortable and say, this is miserable, but I'm going to show up.
Yeah, but I'm going to show up. I'm going to be there. And I love those keys that you mentioned. And I also think that being aware of the people around you and being a part of a community is also a way that we can all be better, because with that example of that teacher, he was aware of what his student was going through and he acted on the thing that he was aware of, on that awareness. So not only being literate in grief and being able to help people in those positions, but also knowing when people are experiencing that, because you are out there connecting with your community.
Yeah, and again, that's kind of the difference sympathy as, oh, poor you, empathy as I understand how you feel, and compassion is I understand how you feel, and I'm going to step in and try to help. So, and then to help in a way that actually helps, not in a way that just is sort of piling on.
Yeah, knowing how to actually be a support rather than doing something that could actually create a burden for people, which is not the
Shooting all over
intention.
them.
Shooting all over them, the motto of this podcast.
Right. Mhm.
So, oh wow. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for teaching us more about how communities can be more compassionate and more supportive of those within them, and for giving us a better idea of how each and every one of us can become more grief literate and become aware of the people in our communities. So I just really appreciate the time you've spent with us in our 3 grief podcast segments, because I'm sure it's been very helpful for our listeners. I know it's been very helpful for me.
Thank you.
So thank you. And thank you everybody who has been listening to these 3 segments of our grief podcast. And we hope that you're able to take the things that you learn and to apply them in your relationships with those around you.
This is Rob Entz, Executive Director of the Utah Commission on Aging. I wish to thank our guest host, Caroline Glissmeyer, and our expert, Dr. Kathy Supiano, and our producer, Glamati Road Pictures. And thank you for your time. Other topics of interest can be found at the utahaging.org website or our YouTube channel. This has been The Wrap on Aging.